So I'd like to introduce our panel for this afternoon. First, I would like to introduce Delphine Munoz, who is currently teaching in the English department at Goethe University in Germany. She is the scientific coordinator of CEREP, which is the Center for Teaching and Research in Postcolonial Studies. She is currently working on a project which will be published in the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, and the title of this project is Minority Genres in Postcolonial Literature. So it's my pleasure to introduce Delphine.
My voice is nearly gone, so I hope I'll be able to get to the end of this paper. Thank you. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on Coolie Woman, a book by Guyanese American author Gautra Bahadur, I'm sure I don't pronounce it right, in which she relies on, as well as imagining around, colonial archives in order to retrace a great-grandmother's experience as an indenture laborer. I feel I need to point out from the outset that my main background is in the literature of the Indian diaspora, not in Caribbean studies or in Caribbean literature, and that it is through a project on the theme of the return in texts written by authors of the Indian diaspora that I first came to be acquainted with Coolie Woman. My determination to explore contemporary representations of the gendered legacy of indenture is closely related to a specific political context, namely the rise of Hindutva in India, the recent election of Narendra Modi, and the ways in which the diaspora-oriented politics of the new India creates new forms of Indocentricity in the Indian diaspora at large, in the Indian nation state, but also in the diaspora at large. So this broader project is also related to a discontent with the ways in which oversimplifying formulations of diaspora have obscured and dehistoricized the two-way relationship between the Indian nation state and its diaspora, old and new. India's refashioning of itself as an economic superpower at the start of the 21st century has indeed entailed, I quote, redefining the labels and parameters of belonging through the creation of flexible forms of citizenship. I'm thinking of the creation of categories such as NRI, non-resident Indians, PIOs, people of Indian origins, and more recently, OCI, Overseas Citizen of India. It is not only that there has been a reimagining of the relationship between citizenship and belonging in India, as Parvati Raghuram and Ajaya Sahu contend, it is also that in today's India, I quote, diaspora becomes the new engine for igniting sluggish economies and for professing exclusive emotional and political affiliations. So in short, my aim is to engage with the ways in which written narratives of the Indian diaspora, the old diaspora and the new diaspora, embrace or resist not only the myth of the global Indian family that has been deployed by the new India of economic liberalization since the 1990s, but also the new forms of Indocentricity and pure Indianness that go with it. And my interest in writings by Indo-Caribbean women writers is linked to the fact that nowhere have I found greater evidence of a determination to unsettle different centers at the same time, among which dominant notions of Indianness. So in these writings, there might be a writing back to the West, as the post-colonial mantra has it, but there's also, perhaps more importantly, there's also writing back to the homeland, in particular a writing back to the new India. So you might have noticed that I've presented Bahadur as an author, and a few words are in order to justify this choice. I'm aware that most of the reviews of Coolie Woman categorize Bahadur as a journalist, perhaps in an attempt to better pigeonhole Coolie Woman as a non-fiction book. Thank you. Still, Coolie Woman might well be a historical rescue mission, as Dominican-American Juno Diaz calls it on the desk jacket of the book. At least my version of it, because I said it was a version on the book table. It remains that it is also a cross-genre or genre-bending literary feast. It is thus no wonder that, while Arun Mukherjee remarked that Coolie Woman, I quote, exemplifies what it is to write history from below, she hastened to add that this book has, I quote, the gripping power of a good detective novel. So my goal in this presentation is to investigate how the literary aspects of the book, including its genre-bending characteristics, raise pertinent questions about the politics of transgenerational memory and unsettle dominant notions of India as a site of origin or long acknowledged mission. It's a quote by Shalini Puri in the volume edited by Gabrielle Hussein and Isabel. So Coolie Woman was published in 2013. Oh, sorry, no, I have to skip a few paragraphs, otherwise I'm never going to make it. So yeah, in this paragraph, basically, perhaps you can move to the second slide. I'm just talking a little bit about the choice of epigraph by Adrienne Rich. I'm not going to talk about that, you have it here if you want to read it. And also the preface in which Bahadur justifies a choice of the word coolie. We can talk more about it in discussion, but I don't have time to that now, so I'm just going to skip to page 4. Okay. So in an interview, that's the epigraph to the book. In an interview with the New York Times, Bahadur insists that her book tells a lost history within a lost history. This is the story of Indian women within the story of Indian indenture. It should be specified here that, even after decolonization, both Indo-Caribbean women and the gender-specific aspects of their experiences were not part of official histories and even literary texts. If, as Alison Ward notes, the past of the Indian indentured laborer is a curiously neglected one, then the generalized neglect of the gendered aspects of indenture take on abysmal proportions. For instance, it has been an established fact since the late 1980s that two-thirds of female migrants heading to the sugar colonies did so as single unaccompanied women, in a similar way to what Bahadur's great-grandmother experienced. However, taking David Aberdeen's Accounting House and Amitav Ghosh's Ibis trilogy as cases in point, Alison Klein remarked that, contrarily to historical evidence, most indenture narratives depict women traveling with a partner or men traveling alone. With regard to Trinidad specifically, Frank Bilbold Singh notes that male Indian Trinidadian writers might also have contributed to what Ramabai Spinett called the phenomenon of the invisible woman in West Indian fiction. Indeed, books by male writers such as Samuel Selvon, Ismit Khan, and V.S. Naipaul, among others, may well contain portraits of many female Indian Trinidadian characters. It remains that these female characters tend to be, I quote, sketched in their physical and emotional outline. Since the 1990s, however, there has been an increased visibility of novels by Indo-Caribbean women writers, as exemplified by the emergence and critical impact of writings by authors such as Lakshmi Pashto, Rabbi Espainet, Shani Mutu, to mention just the most popular ones. Mariam Pirbai aptly notes that several of these works playfully or critically turn the tables on the male-dominated tradition, which has flattened female characters or privileged a male perspective. Importantly, however, the emergence of fully fleshed representations of Indo-Caribbean female characters who are leading participants in the action of the stories is not a literary phenomenon alone. It can also be seen as a transdisciplinary endeavor. Pirbai thus reminds us that Indo-Caribbean women writers have worked, I quote, in tandem with historians in the memorization and excavation of women's narrative. A fine case in point is Maharani's Mystery by the historian Varun Shepherd, in which he uses colonial archives to make sense of the alleged rape and subsequent death of the Maharani of the title on board the Allen Shaw, a ship bound for colonial Guyana in 1885. I bring up Shepherd's book for several reasons. The first one being that when I first heard of Coolie Woman, I instantly thought it would be a sequel, a companion to Maharani's Misery. But this is not really the case. Even if both books use colonial archives to, I quote Shepherd here, recover the voice of the subaltern, their historiographic impulses, to use Pierre's formulation, are framed by two different moments. In Maharani's Misery, Shepard depicts Indian women's experience of emigration in indentureship as one of extreme hardship, and draws explicit parallels between the rape of enslaved women on Middle Passage slavers and Indian women's sexploitation. Shepard's emphasis on the relative similarity of experience between coolies and black enslaved women can be seen as strategic in many ways. Indeed, it identifies points of commonality between Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean women in Afro-centered Caribbean contexts, within which the antagonism between the two communities date back to colonial times. In fact, even if by reopening an inquiry into the voyage of the Alan Shaw, Shepard fails, in fact, to retrace Maharani's experience, she succeeds in exposing the crew's ideology of racial caste and gender superiority, among which the self-serving belief that non-elite women migrants were naturally promiscuous. Published a decade after Maharani's Misery, Coolie Woman appears to share actually, the scholarly apparatus of its predecessor, and makes no bones about the systemic colonial violence to which Indian female laborers and migrants were subjected. Still, it is my contention that Coolie Woman is less framed by the debate that was still raging at the time when Shepard was writing her book. This is a debate, and we talked about that in the previous panel, debate opposing critics who were presenting indenture as a new form of slavery against those who were arguing that indenture had been of significant material benefits for the migrants. I had to quickly return to that debate in chapter 3, using the interrogative form to go beyond a form of either-or fallacy. Did the system liberate women or con them into a new kind of bondage? Were these two possibilities mutually exclusive, or could they both be true? In fact, as many critics have noted after Brinda Mehta, the paradigm shift appears to have taken place toward the end of the 20th century. The shift combines a move towards the rehabilitation of the single female Indian migrants with a transgenerational perspective on the complex legacy of indenture. Foregrounding the pioneering character of the first generation of women having crossed the Kalapani or Black waters, Indo-Caribbean women writers such as Rabbi Spinett and Peggy Moran have indeed participated in recasting the Aji or grandmother figure as a positive role model, and more specifically, as a highly dynamic symbol of reconstitutive identities in flux. This paradigm shift clearly represents a means of writing back to a tradition of misrepresentation within which Indian women migrants were objectified as prostitutes, and that is a classic colonial text, or constructed as fallen women and victims of colonialism, as in the early 20th century discourse of Indian nationalism. Coolie Woman does its share of moving beyond this prostitute/victim dichotomy or stereotype by humanizing and individualizing some women migrants, at times by piecing together the story of female migrants who, like Sujaria, gave birth during the passage from India. My point is that, beyond its generic anatomy, Coolie Woman has certainly much more in common with novels such as The Swinging Bridge and Jarajin, that with non-fiction books such as Maharani's Misery. And Judith Misrahi-Barak, who's here, standing here in the audience, she can go, suggests as much when she brings together The Swinging Bridge and Coolie Woman in a forthcoming article on the narrative of the Kalapani. But there are also structural points of commonality between Jarajin and Coolie Woman. In fact, Alison Klein's remark that Mohan's novel unsettles the boundary between fact and fiction could be applied just as well to Bahadur's book, except that Coolie Woman is labeled as non-fiction. So I will now turn to what I've called the genre-bending character of Coolie Woman, in order to show how its literary strategies not only intersect with, but also rejuvenate the paradigm shift previously outlined. So it's worth mentioning that Coolie Woman is divided in 3 sections, and each of these sections, namely embarking and exploring and returning, appears to mark a phase in a journey. The repetitive use of gerunds is particularly striking here. Gerunds are typically used to characterize actions that have started but have yet to be completed. And here, the 3 gerunds, embarking, exploring, and returning, add to the sense that the phases of a journey are still ongoing, that this journey far exceeds the physical journeys that were undertaken by the indenture ancestors. Towards the end of the book, Bharata reflects on how widely the dream of return was shared among indenture laborers. She also excavates stories of migrants who made it back to India. Some were greeted by Nehru's cruel phrase, "The stubborn people have come." But most migrants headed back to the sugar colonies when it became clear that they had to pay huge amounts of money to be restored to caste, and even then were still treated as social lepers. And this is Gandhi's formulation. Bahadur remarked that, in spite of intense bouts of nostalgia, her great-grandmother never returned to India, and she suggests that unfulfilled dreams of return are passed down through the generations. She writes, "Her desire to see India would be ours to inherit. It would fall on us to realize the return that she never did." Chapter 1 likewise positions the crossing of the Kalapani at the departure point of a journey that continues to reverberate through time and through the generations. This chapter is more autobiographical than historical, in that it starts not with Sujaya's journey, but with Bahadur's own migration from Guyana to the US in 1981 at the age of 7, a departure in the wake of which, I quote, "everything seemed to split apart." Bahadur makes it clear that a return to Guyana 16 years afterwards does not undo the trick of migration. Rather, it causes her to feel a sense of belonging, which, I quote, "now exists side by side with an unnerving feeling of dislocation." It is upon this first return to Guyana, a return which was clearly invested with the hope of restoring her to some kind of pre-departure wholeness, that Bahadur gets to know about her great-grandmother. At the departure gate in Newark, Bahadur's father tells her daughter the story behind their family name, one that does not start with India, but starts with a ship. Bahadur then gets to learn how her great-grandmother Indenture, as an unaccompanied and pregnant woman, gave birth to her own grandfather during the passage from India, and what's more, picked a name for her newborn, which bypassed any pre-existing lineage. Like most Indians who migrated, Bahadur reminds us, she did not have a last name. Of course, there is a fascinating symbolic exchange taking place here across not 1 or 2 or 3 but 4 generations. Bahadur's own dream of return to Guyana is soon to be shattered, yet it is at that precise moment that her father tells her another pre-generational story of departure and impossible return, one that simultaneously recasts her great-grandmother as a symbol for origins and the symbol for new beginnings. Bahadur realized Sujaya's dream of return to the ancestral village in Bihar. But of course, the transgenerational cycle of departures and return has now shifted to the symbolic sphere. In a similar way to what happened in Mohan's Jahajin, in which the female narrator's return to India after several generations is narrated from very, very long distance, narrowly distant at times. India here gets downgraded, or somewhat downgraded, from a symbol of origins to a simple stage of a quest for, quote, narrative gold. Bahadur's visit to Bihar is no homecoming, and she is quick to spot self-appointed rootsmen who escort Indo-Caribbeans through the hinterlands of their foreign motherland and make sure that cash will be traded for fabricated memories. There is a sense that Bahadur's identification with her great-grandmother underpins all of the writing, yet it never swerves into a form of transgenerational entanglement what Toni Morrison called remembering in a different context. The same could be said about her attitude towards documents, which never gives way, and archives, which never gives way to any totalizing reconstruction of the past. Commenting on an 1876 photograph of a plantation estate, Bahadur thus remarks that a character on the photograph holds out something indistinct and furry, which causes her to muse that even photographs leave questions. Ironically, the photograph might or might not be, as you can tell us, the same one which is reproduced in the middle section of the book. The fact that Bahadur leaves it open to question suggests that she nudges readers into imagining too around historical documents. Likewise, in chapter 1, Bahadur refers to a family picture which is not linked back either to the middle section of the book, but which can still be easily identified as being the first one in this section. Again, the suggestion that documents only yield partial truth is emphasized through the discrepancy between the actual black and white picture that you can see when you read the book, and Bahadur's vivid memory of having worn on that day, on that occasion, a Kiskadi colored dress and matching ponytail holders, blinding balls of yellow. With a clear contrast between the colorful description and the black and white picture. Doubt is all pervading in Bahadur's forays into historical documents, colonial archives, and transcripts of interviews. As she relates the story that Sujaria is said to have told about her deceitful or supposedly deceitful recruitment in India, she hastens to wonder whether the eavesdropping child who originally heard the story, I quote, knew Hindi well enough to get the story right. Bahadur is fully aware of the prejudices that are embedded within colonial archives. Looking at transcripts of interviews with coolie women by colonial officials in the wake of allegations of rape, she remarked that, I quote, the questions put to the women have been cut out of the records. What's more, the words are not entirely their own. Government interpreters paraphrase the woman, perhaps even misinterpreting details. At other times, she is racked by self-doubt and comes to question her own interpretative power. How do I even begin to situate my great-grandmother in this odyssey? If I draw an imaginary line from moment to moment on the ships, from glimpse to glimpse of women abroad, will her shape emerge, constellation-like? Would the wrong shape emerge if I connect the wrong moments to one another? How do I know which are right? Will her constellation give off light? The narrative theorist Gerald Prince defines the disnarrated as, I quote, expressions of impossibility or unrealized possibility, epistemic expressions of ignorance, ontologic expression of non-existence, failed attempts, crushed hopes, supposition, false calculation, and so on and so forth. It is worth remarking that in Coolie Woman, Prince's disnarrated takes on momentous proportions. Bahadur India fills whole paragraph with unending strings of questions, formulating and reformulating hypotheses about Sujaria that appear to express her own limitations as well as those of the existing records. I've just used the word appear here because of course there's no dimension to that. By formulating and reformulating hypotheses, Bahadur also grants them some form of existence, a form of imaginary existence, implicitly begging her readers in turn to imagine around her own imagination. And consider this passage, Nihida. I tried to imagine my great-grandmother in Calcutta preparing to board the Clyde in 1903. Had she found a protector? Was he of a caste? In her weeks in the depot, did she see any men see their sacred thread to the river, and if so, did that disturb her? Did the presence of cobra, venomous but venerated among Hindus, strike her auspicious or ominous? Who had certified her as fit to sail and disease-free and pregnant for moth? If the depot doctors didn't really examine women. This presentation has highlighted the literary character of Coolie Woman. I've also tried to show how Bahadur was working towards a non-totalizing form of historical reconstruction that relied on archives and yet merge fiction and non-fiction, while also nudging readers into imagining around the text, a text full of hypotheses and, reformulating hypotheses. My suggestion is that this new form of historical reconstruction, together with the trope of the impossible return, can be mobilized to claim a syncretic brand of Indianness, unsettling constructions of India, both from the nation-state and from the diaspora at large, as a site of origin or longing of legitimation. In that sense, that's my feeling, Coolie Woman participates in a reverse flow through which the old diaspora writes back to the new India of economic liberalization and flexible citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine. It's not often an author is in attendance to hear her own work, so I'm very curious to hear what Gayatri has to, well, your thoughts on this. So we now come to the second presentation by Niloufer Akalim. Niloufer is a PhD student in sociology at SUNY Binghamton. She received her master's degree in sociology from the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. She's now going to talk about how to constitute a gendered reading across the Kala Pani.
Thank you very much. When I first began to read the literature on indentured servitude, the literature seemed ungendered, a term Horton scholars uses for the African slave. The actors were not named, they were not differentiated by gender, and their agency in the constitution and existence of the institution was not acknowledged. They were just numbers, they were just ratios. However, after I came across Gayatri Bahadur's book Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, a narrative based on author's grandmother's personal account, and Marina Carter's path-breaking book Lakshmi's Legacy, The Testimonies of Indian Women in 19th Century, I became aware of the significant number of indentured women workers who fled to Trinidad, British Guiana, Mauritius during 1838-1910. A retrospective on women indentured life through inclusion of new resources and new tools of analysis sought to shed light on important historical facts and broaden our knowledge of the topic. Despite the information passed on, this new knowledge about the realm of this institution made a fact crystal clear. Women were in the colonies as indentured workers. Indentured women's labor was essential for the maintenance and expansion of the production in the colonies. By focusing on the cases of Indian women who fled to different British Empire colonies, such as Trinidad, Tobago, Mauritius, British Guiana, Fiji, and Malaysia in the time period of 1839-1918, in this paper I argue that this institution was maintained through the policies that discursively embodied, controlled, suppressed, exploited, and violated the female indentured laborers. I will start my presentation by giving a brief historical background about indentured servitude. Second, I will illustrate the rising interest to recruit women that is administered by a series of changing regulations between mid-1850s and 1890. Finally, I will discuss the ways in which there has been a major shift in the colonial modes of governing regarding plantation labor by focusing on the enforcement of family formation. For this, I will specifically focus on the morality discourse and the sugar depression in the 1870s. So now I will just give this historical background. The first phase of indentured servitude began in the 17th century and mainly occurred in North America and Canada until African slavery supplanted this. The second phase started after the abolition of slavery in British, French, and Dutch empires under the influence of changing political dynamics. It concerned 2.5 million indentured servants, mostly Indian and Chinese, but also Japanese and immigrants from the Pacific Islands. In the case of the British Empire, indentured servitude initiated from 1830 until 1918. In addition to the economic and socio-political factors that necessitated the end of slavery, the circumstances rising in the post-abolition period required a supply for cheap labor. The abolition of slavery and the appearance of ex-slaves had three important consequences, which could be dangerous for the maintenance of plantations. The first one, with the departure of ex-slaves from plantations, there would be an incredible fall in the number of people who produce sugar. Second one, Since any free laborer was able to produce a surplus beyond the cost of minimum subsistence, the labor was expensive for the agricultural entrepreneur. And the third one, where the land ratio is high, free people would not willingly work for low wages and there would be scarcity of labor supply. The opportunity to establish familial continuity through the land or to run a plantation collectively by free people ran against the economic interests of the ruling classes. In order to manage the decline in the workforce to pursue the sugar cultivation that necessitated a large unit of production, indenture has been configured as an immediate remedy. This was an imperial labor reallocation strategy to cure the labor shortage, but also a tool to enable the planters to undercut the bargaining position of free laborers and to keep their wages low, to punish the black population for having left the estates after the emancipation. Even though it was a transition to a different type of labor, it was inevitable to avoid the perpetuation of slave relations because planters were not ready to give up neither on the product nor on the mode of production. Plantation as a social unit as well as a unit of production continued to establish its legitimacy on ill treatment, abuse, penalties, coercion, and discipline. So the termination of legal slavery did not imply the change of attitudes. Both the dependency between demand of sugar and workforce and the culture in the plantations inherited since the times of slavery were the strongest components and logics that many scholars drew on the structural connection between slavery and indentured servitude. This substantialized the core of the contested aspect in the literature. Even though the technological developments as well as the new political conjuncture could have shaped indentured servitude as a different entity composed of many regulations that differ from slavery, to what extent indentured servitude could not be something other than slavery. Even though the answers and positions were fragmented around this question in the literature, there was an important common sense. The empire needed indentured servitude to sustain and reproduce its hegemonic and economic power after the end of slavery. As in this statement, as well as in a variety of historical accounts, indentured servitude has been majorly displayed as a mechanical institution that functioned around the realm of production without laborers. This might cause to miss an important inner dynamic about this institution that the dominant narrative in this field was not very much concerned about. By bringing in the role of women in the colonies and regulations arranged around them, I aim to illustrate the ways in which the British Empire developed new ways of coercion and control through the gender pattern, which was at the core of the maintenance of indentured servitude and the continuation of production in the plantations. The Hesperus, the first ship departing from Calcutta to transport indentured laborers to the West Indies in 1838-7, had 170 immigrants aboard and only 7 of them were women. Looking at other statistics and the population breakdown in the colonies, it is seen that in the first years of indentured servitude, female laborers formed a small portion of workers, which became to be known as the Indian woman problem. For instance, in 1840, 79% of total arrivals in Trinidad were male, 21% of them were female. In 1839, the Anti-Slavery Society announced their objections against the small number of women among the migrants. According to the Anti-Slavery Society, the increased female recruitment was a moral imperative, and the predominance of males would condemn indentureship to become a new system of slavery. However, the call of the society about the ratio of women was not successfully applied by the plantocracy. Until the mid-19th century, the plantation owners were not very interested in the recruitment of Indian women, primarily because they regarded the importation of Indian women as uneconomical for different reasons. Initially, the planters thought that Indian women were not capable agricultural workers. Men, however, were thought to be more productive, efficient, and capable of heavier workloads. Secondly, the importation of women potentially meant the reproduction of next generations, which seemed to be a hindrance to the plantation owners. In this case, the plantation owners were not looking forward to provide subsistence for the entire family to maintain. After the mid-1850s, the recruitment of women started to be mediated through different policies and quota regulations. In 1857, the ratio was set at 1 woman to 3 men. In 1859, it was changed to 1 to 2, and in 1860, due to difficulties in recruiting the right type of woman, this was reduced to 1 to 4. While the quota regulations were constantly revised, In the 1860s, the murder of women on the West Indian plantations became a serious concern for the colonial office, especially in British Guiana and Trinidad. In 1864, the Secretary of State of Colonies asked for urgent steps to be taken to reduce the incidence, and he advised measures to increase the proportion of women. In 1868, the proportion was again increased, this time to 1 to 2. In 1875, Lord Salisbury mentioned that he prefers a settled and stable community of indentured servants rather than temporary labor engagements, and argued for the emigration of a sufficient amount of women. In the period between 1870 and 90, important changes took place. While the sugar depression had been reigning in the West Indies, the colonial office put into effect new policies and regulations concerning areas such as family migration, marriage between indentured laborers, land ownership, and women's period of indenture. In the 1880s, colonial officials fashioned a piece of legislation to regulate the unsatisfactory domestic affairs of the Indian migrant laborers, as evidenced in the growing incidence of wife murders. In this regard, efforts to formulate a marriage law for Indian immigrants was intensified during 1880s in parallel with growing concern to maintain a stable family unit. In Trinidad, for instance, a marriage ordinance came into being in 1881. While this regulation was promoting the stability of marriage and the institution of the monogamous family, by 1891, a change in policy is discerned, and according to that, men were paid a premium in case they migrate with their wives. Around the same year, two important changes took place. By 1891, restrictions were eased in Guyana, and indentured migrants were allowed to own 17,084 head of cattle and 4,469 sheep. The most important transformation during this process that I quickly tried to overview was about rendering arrival of women indentures as part of the systematic enforcement of the family formation and family establishment in the receiving colonies. This is a serious shift in the politics generated toward female indentures, because thanks to the paramount works of P.C. Emmer, Rhoda Reddock, Baron Shepherd, as well as other scholars, we know that even though official reports underestimated the female presence in the labor force, women were actively working in the plantation since 1840s as individuals who came to colonies to make money or to escape the troubles back home. For instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, the majority of women were involved in agriculture and working in sugar, cocoa, and coconut estates. In Malaya, Indian women worked as rubber tappers and weeders in plantations. Baron Shepherd, on the case of Jamaica, states that, quote, Indian women did not play a primarily domestic role in the 19th century. They were important as agricultural laborers on various properties. Most females available for emigration were single women who had to be recruited as indentured workers, just like their male counterparts. During the shift from importing single women as labor force to requiring more married women, the morality discourse has been widely implied. In most of the cases, migrating Indian women, particularly single women, were characterized as prostitutes drawn from the burgeoning metropolises of Calcutta and Madras, stressing that they were immoral and low. In the 1868-9 period, the immigration agent reported detecting 34 out of 328 women sent to Mauritius as having venereal disease, and concluded, quote, it is but fair to presume that they are women of immoral character, quote. The dissemination of this discourse was to such an extent that women who were not being part of a family were condemned for all the disastrous and immoral acts in the colonies, including wife murders, and there was a notion that single women who were pressed into prostitution remained with the men with whom they formed an irregular union. While this discourse sets the legitimization of the necessity to increase the female indentured population to promote the family formation, they also announced that the colonies were looking for more women, but docile, decent women from better class. According to Patricia Mohammed, both the reason of representing single women in pejorative terms or encouraging and enforcing the family establishment which would become an institution to correct the misbehaviors of the female indentured, were attempts to regain the familial control over women's labor and sexuality by reinforcing the male authority. The policies enforced by the morality discourse have been applied to assign a strict role to women. Planters and officials emphasize these women's roles as wives and mothers, empowering the side of the patriarchal norms, and also this provided stability to the local population and facilitated local reproduction. This transformation was consolidated through certain legislations that attempted to alter women immigrants' position from that of workers to dependent housewives. This perspective had two immediate and concrete results. This discourse could undermine the value of the female labor, which could exploit them more as a source of cheap labor. Even though men and women were involved in the similar jobs, there was a serious wage difference because the family wage concept paid women less and assumed that women were dependent on their husbands. The second consequence was that the discourse enforcing the family formation could bolster the process of detaching women from the production tools, weakening their link with plantations, in other words, with the land. The interest of planters in the restoration of family in the colonies aroused as an economic imperative. This process necessitated more women as part of the creation of a stable workforce, as in the sugar depression taking place in the Caribbean, as well as Trinidad, starting by mid-1870s. The crisis occurred due to the competition from beet sugar. This caused the reduction of many sugar estates and a demand of maximum amount of labor at minimum cost. As a means of overcoming the falling rate of profit, the temporary labor engagement starting by 1875 shifted toward a stable workforce, since women migrants could locally reproduce new labor, which was essential to the calculation of planters. In other words, the increasing interest of planters toward women would guarantee to benefit from the cheap productive and reproductive labor. Furthermore, the nuclear family would be a means to safeguard the falling rate of profit. The family settlement would save the colonies the most of time expired Indians' repatriation. On the other hand, the systematic enforcement of the family formation with the sugar crisis after 1875 set labor control based on the family labor and made women dependent on men. Thus, this could be used to gain control over the woman's access to means of production and source of subsistence. This policy was an important exercise to include indirectly women more in the production, yet constraining them more to the limitations of the household, which would render both them and their labor invisible and limit their mobility. In this regard, women were not only condemned to lower wages, but they were required to cater domestic needs of the family. They were engaged in the production for home consumption and reproduction for the next generation. As a response to the sugar crisis, women were placed in the male-headed household as indentured servants and ceased to work in plantations. To overcome the depression, planters began to encourage cane farming in small family holdings and started to lease out portions of the estate land for cane farming. Yet women were doing most of the work to produce cane and to cater subsistence for food production. That's how the planters would have an alternative source of cane, and this would allow them to cut off women's wages and keep a ready reserve arm of labor for free. As part of this changing labor regime, women's period of indenture reduced from 5 years to 3 years in 1891 in British Guiana and in 1894 in Trinidad and Tobago, which led to limit women's mobility and constrain them in the family holdings. To conclude, I want to stress 3 points. The first one, even though there were many single women who worked in the plantations, the policies after mid-1865 systematically promoted the arrival of women as part of families. The second one, along with these regulations, the empire assigned a new position to women laborers by enclosing them in the household. Thus, a sexual division of labor that also crafted the social relation of production was put in place. Women's domestic work or reproductive services which were enclosed in the household were not considered as part of the labor force. Instead, the unpaid tasks were allocated to them. And the third one, Gendered indentured labor was part of a major shift in the colonial modes of governance in terms of controlling women's labor, turning women into invisible producers and dependent consumers. However, women's activities in the household and in the family, including their emotional care for children and men, clothing, basically responsibilities to maintain the daily life, was essential not only for the sustenance of the social community, but also crucial for the accumulation of capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nilufer. Unfortunately, our first panelist has had a bit of a coughing fit. It does happen to the best of us. Hey, it happened to Theresa May recently, so something's clearly in the air.
Not just the best of us, not just the best of us.
Stand corrected. So our final presentation for this panel is by Christopher Balenji, who is an associate professor of music at Anne Arundel Community College in Maryland, USA. His research interests include Caribbean music, world music pedagogy, ethnographic film, and theatre sound design. And today he will talk to us about tassa drumming as an icon of Indianness in post-indenture Trinidad and Tobago.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you to Tina Remrang for inviting me to submit a proposal for the conference. Thanks also to Brinsley Samaru, who supervised somewhat my research the very first time I went to Trinidad back in 2007. And some of what I'm talking about today is based upon my experiences in that first trip. I'm going to have to start my presentation sitting because the volume knob is down here, and then I'll come back and stand up. So. During fieldwork in the summer of 2007, a friend invited me to a wedding in Aranjuez, Trinidad. I arrived early on Sunday morning, well before most of the wedding guests, yet the DJ was already playing nostalgic film songs while the scent of wedding foods filled the air. Stopping to look, smell, and listen, my friend turned to me, stretching his arms out to take it all in, and said, "Look, it's India, right here in Trinidad." Yet only a short time later, the DJ started thumping the latest chutney soca hits. And this was, in turn, displaced very soon by the ear-splitting, chaotic sound of two opposing tassa drumming bands. The reverberating sound of tassa above all else signaled to everyone in the neighborhood that the wedding had just begun. In this paper, I discuss tassa drumming as part of a complex web of ideas and practices that inform Indian Trinidadian multi-local identity, one that references India as a place of origin, and Trinidad and Tobago as home. I use musical analysis to show that tassa drumming is more than a mere retention of Indian culture, but is indeed a reinvention of such, malleable and responsive to diasporic creativity. It's in this way that tassa has remained not only relevant for performers and listeners, but has furthermore been cultivated as an icon of Indianness in public discourse, especially in terms of national belonging. I begin by situating tassa in historical context, proceed by analyzing aspects of tassa music, and conclude with a discussion of tassa's role in cultural politics. Trinidadian tassa is an offshoot of the North Indian dol tasha drumming tradition. In various forms, dol tasha is still played in India and Pakistan, where it continues to provide music for processional and celebratory events in Hindu, Muslim, and secular contexts. Spread globally by the indenture system, Doltasha styles have developed in many places where workers settled, with especially vibrant traditions in Mauritius and the West Indies, including Suriname. In Trinidad and Tobago, Tassa bands are essential for the annual Jose observance, for portions of the 3-day set of Hindu wedding rituals, and for all manner of cultural and national celebrations. The term tassa refers both to the bowl-shaped drum called tassa and to the ensemble within which it plays a central role. There are 4 musical parts, one lead tassa called the cutter, one accompanying tassa called the fule, one large double-headed dole drum, or simply bass, and one set of hand cymbals called jal, or sometimes brass. Only one player on each part is needed, though bands may include more as desired. As the leader of the ensemble, the cutter improvises both standardized and creative rhythmic passages throughout a given performance, while also playing specific patterns called tals that signal the band to start, stop, or move between sections of music. I'll now play a brief example to illustrate the roles of these instrumental parts in the ensemble. The band performing in this clip is named Trinidad and Tobago Sweet Tassa, founded and led by my mentor, Mr. Lenny Kumar, who's in the center here. The music the band plays here is called dingole, a Trinidad Creole word meaning to dance or thrash about. As its name indicates, dingole is indeed appropriate for dancing. The tassa drummer in the center is the cutter, improvising throughout the example and signaling the tal, an element I'll describe in more detail a little bit later. Among tassa drummers, the term hand refers to an individual musical composition comprising a specific form and featuring a distinct composite rhythm built from the musical layers of the ensemble. Some of the most common tassa hands are rhythmic adaptations from Indian musical sources, some of which have faded from cultural memory while their tassa corollaries have carried on. As new hands have been added to tassa repertoire, this process of adaptation has continued, while the source material has become more diverse, influenced by the changing soundscape in diaspora. Later I'll discuss elements of 2 tassa hands to highlight this process of adaptation. Formal structure in tassa music is at least in part modeled upon what is known in Trinidad as tan singing, or local classical singing, a unique Indian Caribbean genre built upon fragments and elaborations of North Indian devotional, folk, and classical music. Like in local classical music, tassa hands feature a sectional form, including up to 3 musical units. 2 of these, tika and tal, are always present, while the third, barti, is less common. And I should say I'm spelling these terms like they would spell them in Trinidad. You would expect, for example, Indian classical music to spell the word tal differently, for example. So I'm using local spellings here. To understand how these musical units work in tassa music, it helps to examine how they work in local classical songs, where tika refers to the main part of the song and tal refers to a cadential pattern that signals a shift from tika to the barti, a section which, with contrasting rhythm, if not also meter. I'll now give an example of tika, tal, and barti in local classical singing. The following video clip is an excerpt from the popular bhajan Jai Jag Janani Bhavani, sung here by Andrew Suku. I've annotated the video to indicate the use of tal to transition from tika to barti. Following this clip, I'll discuss a tassa hand that features a similar form. Tassa drummers group hands into two broad categories: breakaway hands, or hands for dancing, and so-called classical hands, a category that suggests connection with local classical singing, especially in terms of the tika tal barti form. I'll now discuss a classical tassa hand called chaubola. The word chaubola references a particular poetic structure often used in local classical singing. In the tika for the tassa hand chaubola, the cutter plays a series of formulaic rhythmic passages, followed by a tal that signals a transition to the barti. The band playing chaubola in the following clip is Malik Tassa drummers, here performing at the one-year anniversary of the death I'm known as that guy that cries when he gives conference presentations, because this music is so part of what I like to do. Let me start over. You have to rewind the recording now before you put it on the internet. So, here the band is performing at the death of Krishna Subram Ram. Krishna's son, Sanjeet, is the tassa player, and Krishna was important for my work. An important takeaway from this example is that chaubola and other classical hands re-articulate the basic formal structure of local classical singing, marginally preserving the song form while adapting it to an all-percussion ensemble. While classical hands preserve this tika tal barti form, most hands in the category of dancing hands do not. I'll now discuss a common dancing hand or breakaway hand called calypso to illustrate this point. Just as chaubola adapts a song form for tassa, so too does calypso hand, as it draws rhythmic material from the African Trinidadian genre called calypso, an important carnival time music. The rhythms of calypso hand are based on rhythms played by the steel orchestra, the country's most iconic musical institution that in its early days was an important accompaniment for calypso singing. Calypso hand's affinity with steel orchestral style is most clear in the bass, whose tika mirrors the kind of habanero pattern typical of steel pan bass lines. The fule's tika pattern, comprising a subtly articulated 16th note ostinato, further emphasizes this connection to steel orchestral style, with a rhythm similar to that played by the conga drums and so-called strumming pans or inner voices in a steel orchestra. Finally, the iron, which provides an incessant timekeeping role in the steel orchestra, is also reflected in the rhythm of the tassa fule. In terms of formal structure, calypso hand on tassa does not feature a barti section, as this is also lacking in the hand's source material. Therefore, calypso hand features only tika and generic tals to add musical interest, but do not serve the function of transitioning from one section to another. I'll now play two short musical examples, both recorded by Emery Cook in 1956. One is of a steel orchestra parading during carnival, and one of a tassa band. I present these back to back to draw attention to similarities in musical structure between the two. Note that Cook labels the tassa hand as imitation steel band on the published recording, but it is clearly the hand that most drummers back then and still today refer to as calypso hand. For the tassa track, I've also marked a rudimentary tal. Drummers today tend to play more elaborate tals, though the basic structure of the hand remains the same still today. calypso hand, as we heard here in the second example, likely assumed its current form at least by the mid-1950s, drawing inspiration from the nascent steel bands that, by that point, were an essential soundtrack for Carnival. Yet, contrary to Cook's labeling, calypso hand isn't a simple imitation of the steel orchestra. Rather, it bears conspicuous markers of Tassa's style, most importantly in its rhythmic adaptation of a popular song form to fit the framework of Tika and Tals. This brief musical analysis suggests that Tassa emerges from a coherent musical system, one that absorbs outside influences but does so, at least in one way, by adapting essential rhythmic elements into familiar musical structures. It is through such a process, through rearticulation and adaptation, that Tassa remains relevant for drummers, dancers, and listeners today. For generations, Tassa has moreover provided music for the most celebratory events in the Indian Trinidadian community, all while sounding out the boundaries of Indian Trinidadian cultural space. Through repeated association with such events, Tassa has become a music of national importance, one that frequently is evoked as a metaphor for Indian culture. Many scholars have observed that musical performance in Trinidad and Tobago is frequently imbued with political implications as constituent ethnicities meet in the public soundscape. Rhetoric valorizing multiculturalism, for example, frequently draws upon the notion of musical fusion as a metaphor for cultural mixing, an example of which I observed in 2015, the 50th anniversary of the country's independence. On the occasion, the government distributed banners and posters foregrounding various national slogans within a palette of patriotic colors. One intended to highlight some of the country's constituent ethnicities featured images of an African drum, a cuatro, the small guitar, a cuatro representing Hispanic influence, European brass instruments, a steel pan, and a Tassa drum. These were set against a line from the national anthem. Here, every creed and race find an equal place. There are indeed many examples of Trinidadian musical fusions, both organic and orchestrated. Yet the ideal of multiculturalism, as for example represented in this banner, promotes the potential of a thorough cultural fusion while sidestepping important questions about equal representation, especially where one group is perceived to have advantages over another. In conclusion, I'll now summarize the debate over national instruments, highlighting how Tassa's symbolic power is evoked in cultural politics. The steel pan, or the steel drum, has been Trinidad and Tobago's official national instrument since 1992, though it had been an informal national symbol for decades previous, by virtue of steel pan's compelling, well-researched, and often repeated origin story being closely linked with the country's independence movement. Yet the steel orchestra's earliest and most celebrated heroes are virtually all African Trinidadian. Spurred by what they regard as unequal representation that favors African Trinidadian culture as national culture, figures close to Indian Trinidadian performing arts have, since at least 2005, argued for Tassa to become the country's co-national instrument alongside steel pan. The argument is frequently reinvigorated, often in connection with one of two national Tassa competitions. The steel band advocacy organization Pan Trinbago has consistently pushed back against this effort, accusing those behind it of being racist and unpatriotic, and arguing that Tassa could not and should never be a national instrument because of its apparent foreignness. This conclusion, of course, overlooks Tassa's tremendous transformations in diaspora that separate it significantly from Indian forebears. This not just in terms of musical style, as I've discussed today, but also in technologies of instrument construction, influence on other local genres of music, and increasing professionalization of Tassa bands. I discussed the national instrument debate with my mentor Lenny Kumar, a virtuosic Tassa drummer who has traveled to India and heard Dol Tasha firsthand. As one of the most accomplished drummers in the country, I expected Lenny to be supportive of Tassa's potential elevation to national instrument, which would mean Tassa could likely get the kind of support that has long nurtured the steel orchestra. I was surprised, however, when he said that if Tassa were co-national instrument, quote, "I'd be happy to know that we would get the recognition, but with my knowledge, I know it will be impossible. It wasn't invented here, it was reinvented here. It can never be our national instrument." Lenny's observation is a poignant one. Within the Caribbean soundscape, Tassa indeed features instruments, timbres, musical structure, and performance practice that certainly reference India as a place of origin. Yet, as Lenny further observes, Tasa has diverged significantly from its Indian forebears, so much so that it has been reinvented, such that the very same instruments, timbres, musical structure, and performance practice equally reference Trinidad and Tobago as home. In this way, Tasa's rejection as a national symbol due to its perceived foreignness despite decades of rootedness in diaspora reflects larger and longer-lasting political debates about national belonging, as alternate routes of creolization continue to direct Indian Trinidadian cultural expressions in ways that frequently don't fit a tidy concept of what it means to be Trinidadian. Thank you very much.